Like to call tonight's meeting to order at 6 p.m. And I've been informed that Deputy Mayor Hochstetter will not be in attendance tonight. Do I have a motion to excuse her? Councilmember Botetto,
I make a motion, we excuse Councilmember Hochstetter or Deputy Mayor Hochstetter.
thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilmember Stewart. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? No, passes. 100%. All right, so let me see. Patrick, Councilmember Reed has called in saying he would be late. And Councilmember Newman said she would be on video. And
She's not logged in right now, Mayor.
he's not logged in yet, so we'll wait a few minutes on that one. But let's start with number one, Dig Once ordinance, and I call on Jason Wilson.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm actually going to turn this over to Mr. Steffens, who will introduce our consultant, Mr. Dunn, and give a review of what we'll be talking about tonight. So, Paul, if you want to come up, Jeff, take my seat.
Sorry about that.
Mr. Steffens.
So good evening. With me, as Jason mentioned, I have Paul Dunn from Dunco. The city has been working with Paul to establish a fiber optic master plan. We originally started back in 2021,
Early 21. Yes.
early 2021, to do a fiber infrastructure study for the purpose of creating a fiber network to connect city facilities with the idea of increasing internet speed, internet scalability, not to provide internet for the residents of the city, but purely to connect our own facilities. With that, we identified engineering methods, we identified a planned route, a map, where we connect all these facilities, and then now we're kind of on to the next steps, which, as you mentioned, is the Dig Once ordinance that'll be coming before council next month in the middle of April. So tonight we have Paul to kind of present where we've been, where we're at now, and kind of where we're going. And I will let you take over from there, and I'm here to help answer any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, thank you, and council and mayor. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been just a little over a year since I met with you last, and that was virtually. So
Yeah.
it's good to be here at City Hall with you. I'm going to briefly cover progress we made in the infrastructure study. We'll summarize the network routes that we developed as part of our planning efforts. I'll talk about the Dig Once ordinance and the text, some of the text and principles behind developing that ordinance. Engineering standards, just briefly, I'm not an engineer, so we'll talk about that at a high level. And we'll summarize at the end by the efforts that we're currently working with underway, which is outreach to fiber operators and internet service providers. So in 2021, just over a year ago, I presented to you the fiber optic infrastructure study. This presentation today will be much less technical than it was last year. So we came up with three main categories in that study and recommendations. In addition to defining our routes and the alternative routes for the network, we recommended that Sumner establish a Dig Once policy, that Sumner look at the engineering standards for maintenance of the streets and roads, and that Sumner reach out to fiber operators and internet service providers to see what opportunities there could be for partnership between the city and those entities. As part of and a result of the infrastructure study, we came forward to begin developing fiber optic master plan. So as part of that work right now, plan is developing, it's underway. We've decided on the network routes, and that's where the fiber optic would pass through the city and serve city facilities. We've begun outreach to commercial vendors. I'll speak in a little more detail on that further in the presentation. As Jeff noted, the Dig Once ordinance will come before committee and then council in April 2023. As we continue vetting partnership opportunities, we'll be able to get a clearer budget picture for the actual fiber optic master plan. And then we'll finalize the plan and budget later in 2023. So just to summarize, some of these graphics may look a little familiar. These were included in the infrastructure study. But we developed the network route in 3 phases. Phase 1 was to connect core facilities. Phase 2 was remaining city facilities, and phase 3 was completion of the north-south backbone. This map you see here describes the entire network. In this map here, we show network phase 1. That's represented by the blue lines. They connect City Hall to the future city shops, and the wastewater treatment plant. Construction will be primarily aerial and will trench where we don't have the availability of pole mounting or trail installation. Phase 2 continues, connecting again City Hall to the City Well, Senior Center, Sports Complex, Ryan House, and the Sumner Cemetery. And once again, we'll use aerial installation, hanging the fiber from poles wherever possible. One of the reasons I'll just add for aerial construction is that it runs at about 1/10 of the cost of actually trenching and digging, putting fiber in the ground. So while it may not be the most beautiful installation, because it is on a pole hanging in the air, it is certainly cost effective. Phase 3 of the network completes the north-south backbone. And I will note that there's a lot of interest from the vendors and providers that we're talking to in the north-south backbone. There's a couple reasons for this. One is it connects the southern city limits of Auburn to the, I guess would be northeast city limits of Puyallup at Shaw Road and East Main Street. The existing fiber operators who pass through Sumner do so either on right-of-way that they have under the Burlington Northern rail tracks or down East Valley Highway. Oops.
No, I'm sorry, that's Jason.
Oh, I'm sorry. A north-south backbone offers 2 advantages for those fiber operators. One is a redundant path, so that if there's a problem with fiber on East Valley Highway, say a pickup truck hits a telephone pole or something like that, the north-south backbone provides them with an alternate path for data. Secondly, a couple of the carriers that we've talked with have a strong interest in the commercial passings on 140th and 142nd as they come north to south. So the north-south backbone shown here is in 2 sections. One is the north section reaching from future city shops up to the Auburn city limits. The southern section runs from wastewater treatment plant across the Puyallup River and towards Shaw Road and Main Street. So that's a very brief summary of the routes that were selected through the planning and work that we've done with Public Works and IT at Sumner.
Do they use existing poles or do they put new poles in?
The route that we're considering right now has aerial installation capability all the way. Well, anywhere where there's aerial available. There's a lot of planning that we did that had to look at, well, is aerial available or do we have to trench? If you look at the northernmost section of that backbone, for example, it uses trail. And so we would be trenching or micro trenching along that trail. One of the reasons we chose the trail is construction costs in a trail environment are going to be a lot lower, again, than they would be if you're digging or trenching in the street.
Thank you.
Oh, we lost
Forward.
our.
There we go. Thank you. So one of the recommendations that we made was to establish Sumner as a fiber-friendly city. And that was to open the doors for other participants and vendors to operate and participate in projects that benefit not just the city, but those firms as well. Part of the Dig Once ordinance allows us to reduce redundancy by combining projects. So it makes more sense to say, we have a trench open right now. And we're going to let, say, CenturyLink or Lumen or another carrier also participate in the effort of building conduit or infrastructure in that trench, hence Dig Once. It allows the city to invest in underground assets at a lower cost. So if one of these fiber operators is building out infrastructure and they're trenching and putting in conduit, the city can tag into that project at an incremental cost as opposed to paying the full freight for installation of infrastructure. Dig Once also prepares newly developed areas for later infrastructure expansion. So it has some language that requires people who are developing what's called forefront to actually install conduit along that parcel length so that it's already there and becomes part of the city. It also establishes standards to have projects protect the pavement and streets of Sumner. So specifically within the ordinance, there are a couple real key points. One is protecting the streets of Sumner. You have about 125, 123, 125 street miles, as far as I can tell. And if you have a situation where you dug a trench in 2023, someone comes along and wants to trench again in 2025, if we have Dig Once in place, we might get that done for everyone in 2023. We also put some standards in that ordinance. So asphalt and overlay pavement has a 5-year age. I won't call it a cap, but maybe a ceiling. If someone comes in and wants to trench or put conduit under an asphalt street that's less than 5 years old, they're required then to repave the entire lane width. So instead of the stripes that you see often in pavement, if someone comes to a road that's less than 5 years old for asphalt, they have to replace the entire lane width for repaving. For cement, the requirement is 7 years. Cement lasts longer. And so a 7-year requirement seemed reasonable there. And they'll be required to replace the entire concrete panel that they're trenching under. So again, we want to protect the interests of the traveling public in Sumner and the city's residents. So part of the ordinance goes to that particular goal. I will just briefly note that other cities, counties around the state are adopting Dig Once ordinances. We've noted 6 of them here. Nationwide, 16 states have codified Dig Once laws within the states, governing the whole state. So it's a concept that's catching on, and it does make sense. So briefly summarize the ordinance. This language here is pulled from the text of the proposed ordinance. We talk about the purpose. Again, we want to eliminate or reduce excessive cutting and trenching on the city streets. We want to support this construction of a sustainable, reliable network to connect the city facilities. So the Dig Once ordinance goes to, again, support the city's effort to build out their IT infrastructure. It offers the opportunity for other cities and agencies to participate, And it provides the opportunity for franchisees and other interested parties to participate in those projects. On the policy standpoint, it's in the interest of the traveling public. It allows joint participation in the projects, keeps our streets in good shape, and it requires that certain sidewalks have conduit installed underneath them if they are being newly installed or repaired. So this gets telecommunications conduit out from under the public right of way and places it under the sidewalk. Couple reasons that really makes sense is one, it's a little lower cost to place conduit under a sidewalk. And two, it's less likely to upheaval and issues that you have under a street. Frontage improvements on a right of way are required to add 2 4-inch conduits in the right of way. So that installs conduit for the use of the city down the road. And once again, opportunity for others to participate. I think I lost my clicker again. There we go. Thank you. So as part and parcel to the Dig Once ordinance, revision of some of the city's standard development and maintenance manual items is being undertaken. Public Works is looking at their engineering specifications for patch and cover. So if someone comes in to do a trench, they'll have new specifications that govern how that trench work gets repaired. In a lot of these cases, it's simply a review just to make sure that they're up to date. It's been some years since some of these standards have been revised, so it's a good chance for them to review those. Secondly, the standards will support the language of the Dig Once ordinance. And thirdly, they'll be adding standards for micro trench installation. We talked at length about that with the infrastructure study. One of the reasons that Sumner can be fiber friendly is adding these standards to their engineering standards and development manual. Washington DOT, where a lot of the standards the city uses, does not have standards for micro trench installation. It's a fairly new technology. I would have said 5 years ago, let's not look at micro trench, but the technology has matured. A number of states and cities have placed standards into their ordinances for micro trench. So we see it as a viable alternative, and it makes Sumner a more attractive location if a contractor or a provider can come to the city and see that there's already standards for installation of micro trench. They're not facing an uphill battle to have someone accept that construction technique for building out a network. So again, we go back to that fiber friendly concept, and this gets us a step closer there. So right now, we're in the process of engaging with a number of fiber operators and internet service providers in this area. Overall, we want to investigate opportunities for sharing of projects. If they have work that they want to do in Sumner, can Sumner benefit by partnering with them to build out the infrastructure for the city? Overall, we want to reduce Sumner's costs to implement their fiber network. We want to give opportunities to those vendors to build in possibly a competitive network. As part of those talks, we're going to get a clearer picture of what Sumner's budget posture will look like to implement the network that Sumner needs just for Sumner's operations. And this is the fun part of the presentation. We prepared construction, and I will note right here, no one is asking for these funds tonight. These are construction cost estimates. Now, these were based on the planning and estimating work that we did in the 2021 infrastructure study. We've added a 20% cost increase to the estimates that we did in 2021. In talking with construction firms and vendors who are doing this kind of work, their costs have increased by about 20% over these last 2 years, partially due to supply chain issues, partially due to labor issues, partially due to material costs. It's just been a pretty tough year. In talking with some of these folks, they've indicated that they've had to go back to cities that they're working with change orders to existing contracts because of those increased costs. So we added a 20% inflation cost for the estimates here. We also revised some of the actual network routes to refine them a little bit and make sure that we were traveling down the lowest cost path. And then we began reaching out with these numbers in mind. We began reaching out to the fiber operators and internet service providers in the area. Now we've been in touch with and are working with 5 of the 8 that we contacted. So that's encouraging. Folks are interested in hearing what Sumner has. We presented summaries of our phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 network designs. We've talked with them about what Sumner's needs are, the facilities that we want to connect. Of those 5 right now, I believe 3 are actively engaged in doing some pre-engineering work themselves. They want to understand for themselves what it will cost them to bring fiber into Sumner. So I noticed that there's, or I note here, there's 3 possible funding models. And I call these, if we build it, they will come. That's the first one. The second one is, if they build it, we can rent it. That's the second one. And the third one is, they build it all and we rent some of it. Now, in the they build it all and we rent some of it, that would represent a fiber company or internet service provider coming to Sumner and wanting to build fiber to the premises for all city citizens and residents. And that's actually good news. If one of these carriers comes to town and says, we want to build out in Sumner, they'll be able to provide cost-effective and competitive internet pricing to the city of Sumner, residents, city, businesses. And when you have competition in the marketplace, particularly in the world of the internet, it will drive prices down. So we see that as good news. I didn't put it up here because it's a really big number, but a vendor coming to town could see somewhere in the neighborhood of $19 to $25 million in outlay or investment. That's on the conservative side to build out in Sumner. Now, because they're looking at it, because they're taking it seriously, it tells me that that kind of investment they see as worthwhile. So it's good news that they're paying attention there. If we go back to model number 1, if we build it, they will come. It's possible that Sumner could lease under what's known as an IRU, indivisible right of usage. So it's basically a long-term lease. And we could rent or lease fiber optic strands to a carrier that wanted to have a path. For example, we took the north-south backbone through the city of Sumner and we leased 48 strands of fiber. So that's 24 pairs, 24 communication channels, north to south through Sumner at the average typical metropolitan area IRU cost. I'm getting a little technical here. I'll get to the bottom line. That could allow Sumner to charge in the neighborhood of $600,000 for a 10-year IRU to that carrier. Strand miles are leased, again, by the mile at a per mile rate. If a carrier came in and said, we want 144 strands or 72 pairs to run on that route, Sumner could see at the average rates around 18.5 million for that lease. So obviously these are conversations that you have with those carriers. You match Sumner's needs, Sumner's ability to finance, and the carrier's willingness to lease that asset on a long-term basis. So there are opportunities there. So if we go to number 2, if they build it, we could rent some of it. If Sumner said, we'd like to rent some of it, we want to get 4 communication channels from City Hall to each of our city facilities, which is about standard for what we see in municipal installations. That gives 2 channels for active data and 2 channels as backup within that cable. On a 10-year lease from a carrier at the same rates I just mentioned, Sumner would pay for about $247,000. And they'd have rights of usage for those fiber optic strands for 10 years. Now, there's other figures. Some people do 15 years, some people do 20 years. I kept this presentation at a 10-year figure just to kind of get things in the neighborhood and describe what those concepts look like. So there are opportunities for financing. There are opportunities from these carriers that are looking strongly at Sumner. And they've mentioned in the talks that we've had with them that Sumner and Ording in this valley area are on their radar. So fiber is coming to town, and we'd like to see Sumner become a fiber-friendly city. I'm sure there's questions. I'm happy to answer.
All right, before we get to questions, I just want it on the record that Councilmember Newman joined at 6:18. Now we'll take questions. Councilmember Botetto, you had your.
Yeah. So what is the difference between 5G and the fiber optics? I mean, I know that 5G is being touted as, that's what everybody needs to have. And
Right.
is that a totally different kettle of fish? I guess?
It is a different technology. 5G is traditionally or technically now what they call small cell, and it's a cellular technology. Now, some providers, I know T-Mobile and Verizon will both offer you 5G at home, but it's still a radio device that's sitting in your home, and the data is moving between a cell tower and between your router or your cell phone. Fiber optic is a fiber optic cable. So it's a discrete point-to-point owned. It's not over the airwaves. And that is actually a key point, because with a dark fiber or dedicated fiber network in the city, you have the benefit of security because that's yours. No one can tap it or tie into it. Think of it as glass wire.
Okay. And then what is the timeline that, we've been talking about this for quite a while. So is this like within a year, 2 years, 5 years that, when do you imagine that this could happen in Sumner?
Well, I think there's probably 2 timelines to look at. One would be the commercial carriers who have interest. One of them has expressed interest in, he said, he asked us specifically, well, how fast does Sumner want to work? And he said, well, again, it depends on Sumner's budget. It depends on how they want to implement their network. And he said, well, we're looking at a 12 to 18 month timeline to get things started. And once they build, they're looking at 18 to 24 months to actually build. So they don't want to wait.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good instead of this kind of in the future. It
Yeah.
doesn't work. Okay, thank you.
All right, before we call on Councilmember Cole, Councilmember Reed joined at 6:28. Go ahead, Councilmember Cole.
Okay, so I'm curious, you mentioned that there were 5 to 8 vendors that possibly had an interest. And I'm pretty sure there may be others out there that you are not aware of. So I'm wondering if there is a communication plan in place or will be in place to notify potential vendors that that there are opportunities out there. Or there will
Actually,
be.
yes. In December and January, December 22, January 23, we worked with the city of Sumner to release an RFI, request for information, outlining these plans. And we sent that to about 70 different companies that we know of. Now, we also know that someone in Oklahoma, even though they've done business in Utah, is not likely to do business in Washington. And so if we narrow that list and begin looking at who is doing business in Washington state, both Eastern Washington, Western Washington, we came down to the 8 that we're communicating with right now.
Okay.
So I would imagine as we go further, we can reach out again just to see if anyone else wants in. But right now, we have some pretty solid interest with who we know are local players already.
Okay, very good. And then I'm also curious about the construction cost estimates. Where you break out between phase 1, 2, and 3, and then you have what I assume is a total for all 3 phases.
That's correct.
So those numbers don't quite add up. It's like 5.5 million for the phases all, separately. And then there's a 6 million number there. So what's the difference?
The difference is probably due to my poor Excel skills.
Okay.
There's a lot of computation that goes into building the estimates, looking at the length of each segment, whether it's underground, whether it's in the air, and then it rolls up to get you these numbers.
Okay. Okay. And then one last question, you reminded me about this. You talked about the possibility of, or the plan to build or install poles in trail areas,
Oh,
or to put up poles there. Did I not get that correct?
The installation in the trail areas would be micro trench, so we'd be digging trenches in and around the existing trail and installing fiber there, as opposed to running it on poles or in the ground
and-
on roadways.
Oh, instead of, okay,
Yep.
very good. Okay, then no question there. Thank you.
Remember, or Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. I've got a few questions that bear with me as I go through your presentation here. The first thing, I'm a little confused, maybe Jeff, this could be more for you. This looks like it's a fiber optic plan under the umbrella of a dig once ordinance, as opposed to the other way around. This is a lot of work with fiber optic and and I understand the policy dig once, I'm all for that. But why is it structured like this?
Yeah, really, the dig once is a component of the overall fiber optic plan. The idea was to present just the dig once on its own this evening, but we kind of figured that the dig once didn't really stand on its own without kind of discussing where we're at in general with the fiber plan and kind of where we're moving, and then having the dig once be a component of that. That's why you're kind of getting everything tonight, as opposed to just specifically the dig once ordinance.
Sure, well, that makes sense, and I would imagine that the dig once ordinance would apply in a lot other areas beside fiber optic work.
It's, the
like
dig once
utilities.
ordinance is really specific to telecommunications installations, so not as much with water and sewer and even gas and electric. It's more driven towards telecommunications installations.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand why, and I don't need that explanation now, but on one of the roads that goes close to my house, I think it was the city of Puyallup paid for it, so, but they put a whole new water line in and paved half the road. Okay, so now if we go through and we do something else, we have to pave the whole road. So the dig once thing is something that we should look at from an engineering perspective as well. That's just my thoughts. Okay, and then when this was introduced, and I don't remember, showing my age here, I don't remember when this whole thing was talked about last year. But when Jeff introduced it, he said that fiber optic plan would increase internet speed, and it would be initially used for the city to communicate from City Hall to the new maintenance facility, to the cemetery, yada, yada, yada. And I'm sorry, sir, I didn't get your name, but most of your presentation was built around the fact that we're going to pitch this to other service providers, other vendors, a lot of people that would, if you build it, they'll come kind of a concept. Is this something really that's that major that, I mean, when we want to improve our own infrastructure,
Yeah, so
what are the
this-
plans?
What this does is it gives us the opportunity to kind of go about getting our fiber infrastructure built different ways. One way is that we do it ourselves at a cost of roughly less than $6 million. Good catch there. Another way would be someone else comes to town and they build part of it or build all of it, and we lease it from them kind of in partnership. So in kind of coming up with this plan, coming up with the engineering specs, and then reaching out to these service providers, we need to kind of gauge that interest and see, is someone willing to come in and just build what Sumner needs and lease it back to us? Do they want to build out a system in the entire town and just lease portion with us, or do they just, we want to partner with us on part of it, and another part we might be on our own to build in ourselves? So that's kind of the combination. It's likely that we will end up with a mix of these different scenarios as opposed to just kind of one that's going to cover everything.
Okay.
But yes, our goal is to connect, Sumner's goal is to connect Sumner facilities. Anything else that happens in town would be an ancillary benefit to the community if
So
someone wants to come in.
the routes that you described it on the map, the pictures of the maps, those were created to connect those links from city to city facilities.
Let me go on. Councilmember Reed, and we'll come back to you.
Okay.
Councilmember Reed.
Thank you, Mayor. I had two questions, actually. The first one is in the Sumner Builds It model. Can you tell me how that's different than what Tacoma did with Click?
Yes, Tacoma specifically set out to become an internet service provider with the Click network. And so their initial build was to all covered past residences and commercial entities within the city of Tacoma. So they became an internet service provider. And I think Click has evolved now, and it's now part of a company called Rainier Connect.
Yeah.
The difference with what we're proposing for Sumner is to build a Sumner owned, Sumner leased, or Sumner operated dark fiber network, simply to connect the Sumner city facilities together. Now, in the third example, where I discussed someone coming to town to build out a fiber optic to the premises network for subscribers, the difference in that model would be it would be built by that vendor, it would be managed and operated by that vendor,
And we would be a customer.
and we would be a customer.
Thank you. And that leads me to my second question, because I'm not a fan of a municipality becoming a service provider competing with private industry. I like the idea of putting out a situation to where the contractors or providers would come in and build out the network. My second half of that question is, in that scenario, are there ways for us to incentivize and try and draw the competition from those third-party vendors to come in and build it?
I think one incentive is becoming fiber friendly, having a dig once ordinance that allows sharing of projects. Secondly is the embracing of some micro trench technology. A lot of these vendors are looking to lower their implementation costs. So Sumner in general is being as receptive as possible to the plans and aspirations, if you will, of those vendors that want to come and do business in town. And I think the encouraging factor for those businesses, what they're seeing in Sumner, is opportunity. There's currently really only one major internet provider for all of Sumner. And to bring competition in, they see that as an opportunity. Some of the conversations we've had with them they've discussed their potential take rate, if you will, as being as high as 30%, which is to say they feel they could gather 30% of the existing market share by bringing their business to town. So economically for them, and again, this is their business models, not anything that Sumner has to do, but they see opportunity.
Thank you. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm in favor of the dig once process and the working on ways to incentivize the competition, but I'm not in favor of the build it ourselves model. just if you guys were looking for any feedback.
Thank you. I'll go back to Councilmember Stewart.
No, I'm good.
Are you sure? Thank you. Anybody else? Mr. Brown?
Yeah, I mentioned that already. And if they are, how would this be an improvement?
Yeah, so we are currently connected primarily using Comcast service. We do have some city facilities, like for instance, the senior center where Comcast high-speed internet is not available. So what this would do is if we were to have fiber, it would give us a faster, more reliable connection, something that we could scale and we could build out. It gives us lots of opportunities to bring on different technologies by having a fast fiber connection faster than your at-home Comcast cable. And we wouldn't be beholden to Comcast to have to pay that way, to have more competition in the area, another vendor, depending on kind of how this works and as far as where we'd get our internet from.
And to add to what you said, Jeff, I know this is probably difficult to see. This is in the fiber optic study. But if you look at this as a data pipeline, the blue pipeline represents the speed, if you will, of a fiber optic connection for data. The small green drinking straw down here represents what is mostly Sumner's existing data capacity between sites. So Sumner's paying a premium cost to Comcast and CenturyLink or Lumen for their data connections between sites. And they pay that on a monthly basis. Owning and operating their own dark fiber network increases capacity. It delivers security because it's owned and managed by the city. And it delivers the bandwidth for new and upcoming technologies, possibly traffic cameras, closed circuit cameras at the sports complex, and higher speed data communications just between all city sites.
Our neighboring cities, they have these intelligent traffic monitoring systems and traffic cameras, and they're running that on their own fiber networks. So it is an area where we're kind of lagging behind the develops of the world.
Great. Anybody else? Anybody online? All right. Mr. Wilson, thank you so much.
So the dig once policy will be coming or working its way through committee, Public Works Committee, and then back to full council for consideration. And I think Jeff did a good job of explaining that the fiber study is really, they go hand in hand, because in order to implement the dig once policy, we needed to identify that route that the city has their preferred fiber on to connect all of our facilities. So that saves everybody money in the long run. So not every time we open up the road, we're not putting in empty conduit. That was the purpose of that. All right, so next up, we have the 2022 financial review. Give Jeff just a moment to get the presentation started. Turn it over to Cassandra.
Thank you. So council members, mayor, tonight we are once again talking about 2022. But tonight we are taking a look back and reviewing how we ended up in 2022, focusing a little bit citywide and then looking at the general fund in a little bit of greater detail. So when we are looking at our financial accountability, this meeting tonight is part of that process. That financial accountability begins with our departments. We've asked our department directors as well as our budget managers to routinely review their budgets. We work with them. Our Munis software provides the ability to get reports on demand. And then we do regular finance reviews. We also, at the Finance and Personnel Committee level, we have monthly revenue reporting that's specific to sales tax. That's our largest revenue source into the general fund. We also do a detailed amendment review. Those quarterly budget amendments that come to a summary level to City Council are reviewed down to the line item by our Finance and Personnel Committee. Annually, we also are visited by our state auditor's office. We typically have 3 audits. Done on an annual basis, we have a financial audit that's looking at our position financially. A federal audit that's called our single audit that looks at, are we complying with the terms of our federal grant awards, as well as an accountability audit. And that accountability audit looks at, are we complying with rules and regulations and policies, not only at the federal and the state level, but are we complying with our own policies? Our budget document is a biennial budget. We have quarterly budget amendments. We also do a mid-biennial budget amendment and a final budget amendment. And what these amendments do, it's a really good opportunity for our staff to look at their programs, identify any changes, identify any variances, and also a great opportunity to come before council and make sure that we're being transparent in our work plan and any adjustments to that work plan. So we are going to lead into looking at what happened in 2022 with the fund balance of all of our operating capital and debt service funds. For our purposes this evening, fund balance is the excess of operating revenues over operating expenses. A negative fund balance is a deficit. We avoid those. We don't get to have those. We do have council policies requiring 8% of our general fund operating expenditures to be held as a reserve. So we take that 8% reserves plus our unreserved fund balance, and that equals our overall fund balance. Not necessarily in the general fund, but as we look at our capital funds, we'll often see a decrease in our fund balance. Those are expected and anticipated as we accrue balances for capital projects to be drawn down. So we are just going to take a look at the fund summary. In our general fund, our fund balance increased at the end of 2022. We did have higher than estimated sales tax revenues, as well as building permit associated revenues and utility taxes. Our department expenditures were within their budgeted amounts. And we did have some increased transfers to support design of our public works operations facility, and that is pending a financing plan with a debt issuance component. We do have Fund 002. This is our general fund reserves. This has a balance of a little under $1 million. This was set aside years ago and requires a council supermajority to access. We touch on this one every year and every other year as part of the biennial budget process. This didn't have any 2022 activity, and it doesn't have any activity programmed for the 23-24 biennium. Our building reserve fund did increase its fund balance slightly. We had an annual transfer in from the general fund. That is something that has been occurring for the past several years as part of our property tax levy. A portion of that is dedicated to our building reserve fund to accrue for facilities improvements. This fund did have a transfer out of some of that to support City Hall technology upgrades. And that includes the upgrades that we see here in council chambers and in our emergency operations center. We have special revenue funds. These are funds that are funded entirely by or almost entirely by revenues that are restricted for a specific purpose. Our complete streets fund, the fund balance decreased really down to 0. And that was final expenses closed out the grant. That was funding received by the Transportation Improvement Board. And so that work program is complete. We have a drug enforcement fund. This really stayed about status quo for 2022. We had a small collection of forfeit red property, but based on change in legislation over the past decade, this fund typically has a very low activity. We do still keep this fund active though, because those funds are restricted for specific uses. And so it has its own separate accounting. Our tourism tax fund decreased in its fund balance due to transfers out to support projects. And really that's what that is intended to do. The revenue collections were within 2% of our forecast. So hats off to our communications director who kind of eyes at making those revenue forecasts. And then we had transfers out of tourism to support the Heritage Park design, as well as Ryan House. Our ARPA fund, this is the special revenue fund that accounts for all of our ARPA revenues. We received the final tranche, a total of $2.91 million. That's going to be allocated it's primarily allocated, it'll be spent over the next several years. Those allocations are recommended by the ARPA committee and adopted by budget amendment. So there's a small amount, I believe we are under $100,000 that is unallocated. But for the most part, everything, the bulk has been obligated and is just pending action. In our debt service funds, we do have debt service funds. This is a governmental fund. We really don't have any general obligation debt. The only debt currently accounted for in this fund is LID number 78. This was 136th and Valentine. So this fund balance did decrease just for scheduled debt service. That is, the revenues into this fund are assessments. There are property assessments on the 136 Valentine project. And then the interest is paid for out of the fund. We have a kind of a corollary fund or LID guarantee fund. There's no programmed or actual activity in this fund. It does have a balance in it, and that's required by statute. And really that is an insurance balance where we hold aside a certain percentage of the revenue from the 136 and Valentine LID in case any of the property owners were to default, we would still be able to pay our debt service. We get into our capital funds. This is where there's a lot of action. In our sidewalk capital fund, the fund balance decreased. Again, we expect to see this as we spend balances down for planned capital projects. These projects included Sound Transit sidewalks, the River Grove pedestrian bridge, as well as 160th Avenue pervious sidewalks. Funding really into this fund is general fund support that's programmed through the budget, as well as capital grants. And those grants may be anywhere, again, from our partners such as Sound Transit to the Department of Ecology. And those are all accounted for in this fund. Our REIT fund, this is real estate excise tax. It's separated out into two revenue streams, REIT 1 and REIT 2. Both are have very specific rules for their use under state legislature. Our collections exceeded our forecast by 15%. This is completely dependent on real estate activity. So as real estate is sold, we get a portion of that. Transfers out into this fund for 2022 supported our Wooner project, as well as the acquisition of 902 Kincaid and some right-of-way acquisition at Wood and Main. In our Parks Capital Fund, projects include our Friar Avenue Trail, as well as activities out at Bennett, Loyalty, Heritage, Rainview, and Siebenthaler. The fund balance increased. That's going to be a temporary increase. We had to transfer in from the ARPA fund to offset the Portland lose. Well, we're spending that down in 2023. So we will see that fund balance go back down in 23 as we spend down on additional projects. Again, the funding includes grants as well as local funds. REIT is really one of the biggest contributors into the Park Capital Fund. The Street Capital Fund, we have a lot of revenue sources into this fund. It's state and federal grants, impact fees, other contributions. This is also where we see revenue coming in from our property taxes. We allocate a certain percentage of our annual levy into this fund to support leveraging for grant projects. And so we finalized the 410 Traffic Avenue and ramped up spending on Stewart Road Bridge, as well as State Route 410 166th Wood and Main. And then we are just now closing out the Sumner Taps Guardrail project. So there's a lot of activity going on in our Street Capital Fund. And then to close out our capital funds, our fund balance decreased in our Facilities Capital Fund. This is Fund 325. Really, there's two projects going on in this fund right now. We have some minor projects, but really the highlights are in 2022, we had city facility improvements for COVID-19 requirements. And that really is the upgrade of the bulk of the upgrade of our audiovisual throughout the buildings, including in this room, as well as the EOC, the fishbowl, and the conference room across the hall. And then the design of the Public Works Operations Facility that is funded with general fund, as well as water, sewer, and street funds based on a calculation that was essentially prorates those out to their user funds. As we leave the capital funds, we get into our utility funds. Again, I know it sounds like a broken record, but a lot of activity going on in these funds. For water, sewer, and storm, our revenues were consistent with our forecast. Those are forecasts using a rate model that's done generally every other year. We did miss last year, so we could pull the rate model forward to doing it in 2023. So we'll be beginning that. So I believe they've already done the RFQ interview process for that. Capital projects in the water fund were earthquake control valves, tank painting, 24th Street utility relocation, and then of course the town center improvements to Alder and Kincaid, which we'll see flowing through to the sewer fund as well. Along with in the sewer fund, lift station improvements, the 24th Street utility location, there were improvements that were completed or began at the treatment facility, at the wastewater treatment facility, and then the town center improvements. I'm going to skip over to stormwater. The White River restoration and the town center improvements were the primary projects in 2022. We also are getting funding into our stormwater fund to support that White River project. The highlight in 2022 was a little over $1 million from the Pierce County Flood Control. And I believe we will be coming back to you at some point with an update on that project, including kind of what that funding mix looks like. There's a lot of partners on that one. We do have a utility bond reserve fund that's had a very small change for some interest received. This fund is reserved for future use. It's very similar to the LID guarantee fund. It's there as an insurance for bondholders. We do anticipate at some point issuing revenue debt for the Public Works Operations Facility. So we'll be using this fund and the reserves that are in there to kind of help offset those coverage requirements. Our cemetery fund, this is for reporting, we combine this with cemetery operations, which is Fund 410, and then Fund 415, which is our cemetery development. This is subsidized by the general fund for cemetery operations. That continues to be the case through the 23-24 biennium. We are seeing some recovery in the revenues kind of post-pandemic. If you recall, during the pandemic, the revenues at the cemetery really just dropped off quite steeply. We just weren't having the services that we were normally having because of gathering restrictions. We're seeing those begin to recover. So the cemetery actually met and in some cases exceeded their revenue forecast, which is great. And what that means is it still requires a subsidy from the general fund, but we didn't have to increase the subsidy. In Metro Animal Services, this is our Fund 440. We did have a fee increase to the partner cities for beginning in 2022. We are seeing the shelter revenues also begin to recover from the pandemic impacts. For quite some time there, the shelter was either closed to customers coming in or it was by appointment only. And when you're doing that, that's very difficult to make up your adoption revenues and your impound boards. And it's not a good position to be in. So those revenues are beginning to recover. That fund operates just with a razor thin margin. So we are routinely reviewing and just routinely kind of analyzing to be sure that the cash flow is sufficient. So as we move out of our enterprise funds, we look at our internal service funds. These are funds that provide services to other departments. And so they are funded by user charges to the other funds. The general fund pays a portion as well as some of our capital funds. So unemployment insurance, the fund balance dropped down. We are self-insured for unemployment. So as claims come in, we pay them out. They're processed upon receipt. And then as that fund begins to dip below kind of a set floor, it is supported by usually a subsidy from the general fund. Fleet operations fund, our fund balance did dip a bit for 2022. We will be updating our rate model, so we'll be able to recapture some of those costs, but really what we're seeing is an increased labor, but primarily increased supplies and fuel costs over the biennium have impacted that fund. In our IT fund, our fund balance increased. This is supported by user funds. It's based on both kind of a weighted model between equipment as well as FTEs. We'll see that fund balance kind of reset itself, I hope, knock on wood, at the end of the 23-24 biennium. The reason that the fund balance increased is because we had some delays in some purchasing due to supply chain challenges. There are some things that we just simply can't purchase right now, or if we place the order, it's going to be several months before we actually see it come in. And we saw that same thing in our fleet replacement fund. This is Fund 555. The fund balance increased because we had a lot of purchases delayed by a long lead time. We ordered 13 vehicles, we received 6. We're still waiting on some of those other 7. So the funds are obligated, but they just haven't hit our fund balance yet. We're hopefully eventually going to get those vehicles. And then we have a small group of fiduciary funds. Fiduciary funds are funds that we are holding in trust or a custodial fund for another group. Our cemetery endowment fund increased. We're always going to see this fund balance increase. Per our municipal code, 10% of all of our lot sales are reserved for perpetual care. The principal cannot be used, only the interest on that fund. So it just continues to grow. Our developer impact fee fund 605, this did go down in fund balance as transfers out are processed according to our budget appropriations to support capital projects. So this includes our impact fees for parks, fire mitigation, and streets. Our firefighters pension fund increased just a little bit. This is funded through a state shared revenue as well as a general fund subsidy. And then our employee trust fund, this will always go down. This accounts for our employee contributions for our child care assistance program. So as the funds come in, they go right back out. So those are custodial. They're not available for general use, but we have to account for them. Okay, before I delve into the general fund, are there any questions on any of the other funds?
Any questions? Councilmember Cole.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just one quick
Yeah.
question, sorry. And this is about the sidewalk capital fund.
Okay.
302. So the River Grove pedestrian bridge was in there. What kind of expenses are there? Because I know the bridge isn't there yet, so I'm wondering what's going on.
There's been some design costs.
Design costs.
Yes.
Okay, all right, that's it. Okay, thanks.
Okay, the general fund. So the general fund is really our primary operating fund. If we take a look at it at a glance, so when I'm looking at the general fund at the end of 2022, I'm looking at it both for what happened in fiscal year 2022, but then also I've got information for kind of how we ended up with the 2021-22 biennium. But just looking at 2022, our revenues versus expenditures were within our revised budget. Sales tax revenue, energy and communications tax revenue, and charges for goods and services, which includes building permit fees, or all above our projections. Our property tax revenue was within, as well as our other revenues and our expenditures. So this is just looking at 2022. This is our revised budget. It's the second year of the 21-22 biennium. We received 115% of our forecasted revised revenues. And again, what was over in projections were the sales tax as well as energy and communications taxes and building permit revenues. And then we expended 101% of our revised expenditures. We were just right on the edge. When we look at our 2021-2022 revised budget, so this is looking at the biennium as a whole, again, 115% of our revised revenues and 100% of our revised expenditures. We were kind of right on target. And I think a lot of that is due to just kind of that continued monitoring and the budget amendments. You know, we're trying to stay timely on any programmatic changes, and that helps us be really right on line with where our forecasts are. Property tax is the most stable revenue source into our general fund. It's 23% of our general fund revenue. It's adopted in November for the next year. And you can see here kind of where the city is on that. That's where that yellow arrow coming in, we get 8% of the overall property tax levy. And you can kind of see the split. So I know that we've talked about this quite a bit in the past few months. So when we're looking at this, and then we look at our property tax revenue distribution. So you can see our assessed valuation as well as what goes into the general fund, as well as streets for both operations and capital in the city council strategic reserve. One of the reasons I like this graph is it really does show kind of the cash flow of the property taxes. Pierce County acts as our treasurer for property tax under state law. And so, you can see kind of when those property taxes are collected by the county, and then we get them a month later. And then over on the little schedule, those bottom two lines, this is really why I say it's our most stable revenue source. We levied 4.258173 and we collected 4.258093. So it's a remarkably stable revenue source. And it's just something that we just take into account, kind of the dips, the valleys and the peaks of the cash flow. When we look at sales tax, it's our largest revenue source, but it's also our most dynamic and kind of unpredictable. Destination based, so supply chain can be a challenge to the support. We get 10%, or I'm sorry, we get 10 cents out of every $10 purchase in Sumner. So just try and keep spending in Sumner, because all those dimes add up. When we are looking at our sales tax, just a couple of things to note. We're always looking at receipts occur 2 months after the activity. So transactions in October are reflected in our December receipts. So we're always kind of chasing that 2-month lag. And that lag really is when we get both the reporting and the distribution that are coming in from the State Department of Revenue. One of the things that we report on regularly is kind of what that split looks like, what that pie chart looks like for our monthly receipts, and looking at what's the percentage that our top 5 remitters are bringing in, because that really does speak to the diversity of our sales tax base. We can see from here, I am using the December 2022 receipts. So this was October transactions. Our top 5 remitted about 25%, construction about 20%, retail and trade about half, and then everything else made up the difference. So this is something that, again, we report on regularly on a monthly basis to our finance committee. And it's really one of the revenue sources we keep the closest eye on. You can see, looking over at the graph, we had a good year for 2022. We continue to see a positive sales tax trend. The pandemic really didn't have a massive impact on Sumner. You can see, if you look from 2019 to 2020 and then to 21 and 22, the burgundy portion of the column is our non-construction based sales tax. And then the light blue is receipts that are brought in from construction activities. Those receipts brought in from construction activities are great. They're a good percentage of we don't consider them as being a future constant recurring revenue source. Our buildable lands and our projects are finite. So really our focus is on that non-construction number. And we are continuing to see that grow. We are seeing that begin to flatten. So that growth is kind of moderating. If you look kind of at the gap between the 2020 to 2021 number, and then from the 2021 to 2022, you'll see that gap is starting to narrow. And that's really what we've been expecting to see as the economy still has its challenges with inflation and some other challenges. So we are starting to see that flatten, but we're still within kind of a positive growth trend. We're just still being conservative on what that's going to look like over the next biennium. When we look at our general fund expenditures, again, this is our second and final year of the biennial budget. Our department directors really do have the latitude to use their biennial appropriation at any point in the biennium. So if the appropriation, it can all be front loaded into the first year of the biennium, or it can wait until the second year of the biennium. But where we're looking at is really that bottom line. And we have a good idea of where that forecast should be at the end of the first year and the second year. At the end of 2022, our judicial was a little bit over their budget due to some retirement payout of lead banks. Development services was a little over their budget due to contracted building inspector services. But where that offset is in the increased building permit fees that we see that help offset those contracted inspection. Non-departmental was a little over their budget, 105%. This was due to fire permits. This is offset by revenues. Interfund charges was 105% of the budget. There were some increased assessments due to additional purchases I believe those are IT based. And then transfers out was over the budget, and that was again to support the Public Works Operations Facility pending debt issuance. Eventually, as we issue bond anticipation or take out debt, some of that will come back into the general fund as we kind of finalize what that funding mix looks like. So looking at just 2022, I like this graph. It really does show by department where kind of the distribution of expenses are, as well as how all of our departments performed at the end of 2022. So the burgundy number is our revised budget and the blue is the actuals. And you can see for the most part, we are right on where our estimates were. And then this is the same graph, but looking at 2021-22 as the biennium. Okay, any questions on that before I jump into the financial model?
Any questions? Mr. Stewart?
Yes, sir.
I should know the answer to this question, but do you support department directors or staff to have a use it or lose it mentality if they have a little bit extra to spend it before the end of the year?
No.
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Councilmember Cole?
Just one quick question about, when you talked about, I think it was the judicial area that went over 17% because of a retirement payout. Does the city budget at all for those, or it is just as they happen?
So it generally is as they happen. The judicial's a little bit of an odd deck. Normally, if we have a large payout, it's offset within that department because then there's usually that budgeted position is usually vacant for a little bit before it's filled, and that helps offset any kind of payout. Judicial's odd because just it doesn't have any other position to offset it. So
Okay,
that's
that
where we
makes
see
sense.
that.
Okay, thanks.
I don't see Councilmember Reed. He's not there? All right, Councilmember Newman left a while back, so
They're there. They just questions right there. Yeah.
okay. All right. Guess we're done there.
Oh, not quite. I have more slides.
Oh, yeah, I know. No, we're done with questions. I assumed you had more.
This is my chance to talk about budget. So one of the things that we are constantly refining is our 6-year financial model. And this is kind of the backbone of where we look at for our general fund for budgeting, as well as what I'm forecasting and reporting. And then when we're doing our financial reports, this is my source for that too. When we are looking at the model, we're always taking into impact what our considerations are when we're doing our forecasting and our assumptions. We are still dealing with some COVID pandemic after effects. Primarily what we're seeing in the economy is all kind of driven from that. Inflationary pressures are starting to ease, but we are still seeing them along with interest rate pressure. Supply chain challenges I already touched on. It would be nice if we eventually get all the vehicles we ordered. And I know I believe our IT department is still waiting on some network equipment. Social equity, this is an important thing. This is making sure that we are spending our resources to benefit the entirety of our community. Competing priorities for limited resources. We saw that kind of big time during the budget process, just as we were bringing lists of all of the things that were requested that all had value, but we couldn't fund during this cycle without additional resources. Increasing labor costs, and then upcoming development. And the development is kind of both sides. It's both the revenue forecast for the development fees that we may see for what's in the pipeline, but then after it's built, it's the expense side on what kind of services do we now need to be sure that we're able to provide for this additional development. So taking all those into consideration when we put our model together, this is the condensed version. It's a lot of numbers, but it looks at our 21 and 22 actuals, as well as our proposed for 23, 24, and then our forecast through 2030. One of the things we are always looking at is kind of in the middle, that middle row that says excess and then in parentheses deficiency. This is, do we have a structured balanced budget? Are our current operating revenues meeting our current operating expenses? And we're always looking at where are these lines crossing? At what point do our expenses outstrip our revenues? So we can see in here for 23 and 24, that biennium is actually a bit unbalanced. It's balanced as adopted. What's throwing that a little bit off is that line right above it where the potential operations facility debt services. And we've kind of just put a placeholder in there for the 23-24 biennium and then moving forward. With that placeholder in there, we can see that our lines are crossing in the 25-26 biennium. We're still structurally balanced with a little bit of I don't want to say cushion because I don't like that word, but we're still structurally balanced. But then in 2026, we see those lines start to cross. And then looking further on, it's a matter of, looking to see where our revenues are specifically with economic development, as how it impacts our sales tax, as well as what our construction sales tax is doing, development revenues, and then what our expenses look like to be sure that we can get back to that balance section. The second to the last row on here is our required reserves. Again, by council policy, we're required to keep 8% of our operating expenses back as a reserve. We're going to be coming to finance committee this year to talk about that. We've been very fortunate with a strong fund balance, but is 8% enough? We've seen the uncertainty in the economy, as well as, just as our expenses continue to grow. Is that 8% adequate? Should it be something else? And that's a conversation we'll be having with our committee and then likely at a study session with the full council. And then on that bottom line, you'll see our property tax reserve that's held back for council use. At the end of 2024, that was $754,000. With the 2023 allocation from our property tax level, that brings the end of 2023 up to 1.104. So happy to answer any questions on the model. I'll just flip quickly to the next slide, which kind of gives you the same information, just in a more graphical, kind of seeing where those lines are beginning to touch and then cross.
Do we have any questions for Cassandra? Seeing none. Getting off her easy tonight.
So happy to answer any questions if you think of any later. Just please stop by my office or shoot me an email or give me a call.
Oh, we do have a question from Councilmember Reed.
I just have a big thank you for Cassandra. I know how much fun you have with putting these together, and they're amazingly beneficial to us as council, in my opinion, for having a good idea of the financial stability of the city. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
There we go. Oh,
I just want to say that you just make this seem so easy, but really understandable, and I really appreciate that.
I appreciate it.
Councilmember Brown.
Nice job. And, do we have any funds in the Silicon Valley Bank?
We do not.
Good.
So all of our funds are held. We have 3 different places right now our funds are held. Bank of America, as well as the local government investment pool, and US Bank holds our securities. So those are the treasuries that we own. We have 1 outstanding treasury, doesn't have any kind of exposure at all. We are protected at Bank of America. I think we're very fortunate here in Washington State. We have, of course, everyone has FDIC protection up to a certain dollar amount, right? In Washington State, there's also a Public Depository Protection Commission that protects for municipal or public deposits, that protects anything above that amount. So that's a state program that we are covered for anything else, but we've got no exposure to that current situation.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else?
Thank you very much.
Nobody online? All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra. Okay, we will move on to city administrator report.
And I have nothing tonight, Mayor.
Nothing there. Council meeting agenda calendar. Anybody have any council meeting issues? None? Any committee issues? Oh,
Mr. Reaper.
Patrick.
Not necessarily an issue, just a heads up that the next couple of weeks, my timeline's gonna be really tight to get here right at 6, so I'm gonna do my best.
Thank you. Any committee issues? No, seeing none. No executive session tonight? So I will call us adjourned at 7:22.